One moment, one sentence, 5 simple words. That's all it took to change everything. If you've ever felt stuck, hopeless, or afraid to move forward, then this story is for you. If this story inspired you, like, subscribe, and share your own English learning journey in the comments. 3 years ago, I hit rock bottom. I had just failed my third job interview because of my English. I couldn't express myself. I felt like a child in a world of adults. And the worst part? I started believing I wasn't good enough. I wanted to give up. Maybe English wasn't for me. Maybe I was just meant to stay silent. Every rejection made my confidence shrink until I barely had any left. One evening, I sat alone in my small apartment, staring at a rejection email on my laptop screen. My heart sank as I read the words over and over. No matter how hard I tried, my lack of English skills kept holding me back. Frustrated, I closed the laptop and buried my face in my hands. Was there even a way forward? I had always dreamed of working in an international company, traveling the world, and meeting people from different cultures. But without English, those dreams seemed impossible. My self-doubt kept growing, and I started isolating myself. I avoided social gatherings where I might have to speak English. I stopped applying for jobs that required fluent communication. Fear controlled me, and I didn't know how to break free from it. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake, thinking about all the opportunities I had missed because I was too afraid to speak. I remembered the times I had tried to order food in English and messed up, feeling humiliated. I recalled the job interviews where my mind went blank because I couldn't find the right words. It was a constant cycle of disappointment, and I was tired of failing. I needed a change, but I didn't know where to start. The fear of making mistakes kept me trapped in my own limitations. I wanted to improve, but I was scared, and that fear was the biggest obstacle in my path. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, staring at an English book. I wanted to improve, but the words on the pages felt overwhelming. My mind kept replaying my past failures. I sighed, feeling lost. That's when an old man sat beside me. He was dressed simply, with a kind face and wise eyes. He watched me struggle with my book before finally speaking. "Are you learning English?" he asked with a gentle smile. I hesitated before nodding, feeling embarrassed. He chuckled, as if he understood my frustration. Then, he leaned in slightly and said something that I will never forget. I had no idea that this stranger would say something that would change my life forever. He seemed like an ordinary person, yet there was something different about him. His presence was calm, and his eyes held a wisdom that made me feel safe. "I used to struggle with English too," he continued, sensing my discomfort. "But then, I learned something that changed everything." Curious, I leaned in, waiting for him to share his secret. "Don't fear, just keep going." 5 simple words. At first, they didn't seem like much, but something about the way he said them made me pause. Don't fear, just keep going. Was that really the key? I looked at him, confused. But what if I keep making mistakes? What if I never get better? I asked hesitantly. The old man smiled. Mistakes are proof that you're learning. The only way to fail is to stop trying. Just keep going. I didn't fully understand the impact of those words yet, but they stayed with me long after he left. Something inside me shifted. Maybe I had been too focused on my failures instead of my progress. I went home that night, repeating those words in my head. Don't fear, just keep going. I wrote them down on a piece of paper and stuck it on my wall. I didn't know if they would work, but I was willing to try. I had nothing to lose. That night, I went home and decided to change my approach. I took those words to heart. Every day, I practiced. I spoke to myself in English. I watched movies, repeated lines, and even joined an online English group. I stopped fearing mistakes and just kept going. My progress wasn't immediate, but little by little, I improved. I made a schedule. I woke up early to read English books. I spent my lunch breaks listening to English podcasts. Before bed, I practiced speaking in front of a mirror. Some days were frustrating, and I felt like giving up, but I remembered the old man's words. Just keep going. Weeks turned into months. My confidence grew. I started speaking more in public. I made friends who spoke English fluently, and I learned from them. I started applying for jobs again, this time without the fear of rejection. A few months later, I found myself sitting in another job interview. This time, I wasn't frozen with fear. I wasn't perfect, but I spoke with confidence. And guess what? I got the job. 1 year later, I returned to the same coffee shop. This time, I wasn't the nervous, struggling English learner. I was helping someone else, just like that old man had helped me. I sat down next to a young woman who was staring at an English book, looking frustrated. She sighed heavily, just as I had once done. I smiled and asked, "Are you learning English?" She hesitated before nodding. I could see the embarrassment in her eyes. I remembered that feeling all too well. I used to feel the same way, I told her, but someone once told me something that changed my life. She looked at me curiously, waiting for me to continue. I leaned in and repeated the words that had carried me through my darkest times. Don't fear, just keep going. The woman's eyes widened as she absorbed the words. She was sitting across from me in a small coffee shop, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee. Just keep going, she repeated softly, a hesitant but curious smile forming on her lips. I could tell that something inside her had shifted, just as it had for me a year ago. Her voice, which had been so quiet and unsure just moments before, seemed to gain strength. Something in her was awakening, and it was not just the words I had spoken. It was the realization that she could overcome the fear that had kept her silent for so long. I had been where she was, paralyzed by fear, unsure if I could ever speak English confidently. But I had learned, as I hoped she would, that the smallest actions, like speaking, even if imperfectly, could lead to the biggest changes. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time with her. She began to open up about her struggles, her fear of making mistakes, the embarrassment she felt whenever she tried to speak in English, even the shame of not being able to communicate with people in her workplace. As she spoke, I could see her vulnerability. It wasn't just the language barrier that held her back. It was the weight of society's expectations, her own doubts, and the fear of judgment. I began to understand that learning a language wasn't just about grammar and vocabulary. It was about overcoming these invisible barriers that kept people stuck in their fears. I shared my own story with her, the same struggles I had faced, and how the turning point for me had been embracing the fear and continuing despite it. The first time she spoke confidently in English was a moment I'll never forget. We were at a local market, and she hesitated for a moment before asking the vendor for directions in English. She stumbled over a word, and for a brief second, I saw the familiar panic in her eyes. But then something shifted. She took a deep breath, repeated the phrase, and this time she spoke it without hesitation. The vendor smiled and nodded, offering her clear directions. In that moment, I saw not just a person who could speak English, but someone who had overcome the invisible barrier that had held her back for so long. It was a small victory, but it was monumental. She had crossed a threshold, and I could feel the ripple effect begin to spread. That one act of courage would change the way she viewed herself and her potential forever. As the months passed, I continued to check in with her. Each time we spoke, I saw her growing more confident. She no longer hesitated when ordering food in English, and her interactions at work became smoother. It wasn't just about speaking the language, it was about reclaiming her confidence, asserting her presence, and no longer shrinking away from challenges. The 5 words, "Don't fear, just keep going," had become her mantra, and they were now part of her inner dialogue. Her progress was not just about language, it was about breaking free from the confines of fear that had once defined her life. She became a source of inspiration for others in the community. She began to share her story with others who were struggling, encouraging them to take the first step. Her story resonated with them because it was real, it was relatable, and it showed that progress didn't come from perfection, but from persistence. I watched as the ripple effect continued to grow, spreading out beyond the coffee shop and into the lives of others. It wasn't just my words that had changed her life. It was her willingness to embrace her fears and push forward, step by step. As I continued my journey, I met more people who were struggling with English, each with their own unique fears and insecurities. Some were professionals who couldn't speak up in meetings. Others were parents who wanted to help their children with homework but were afraid of making mistakes. I shared the same advice with all of them. Don't fear, just keep going. But as I worked with them, I realized that language learning wasn't just about mastering words and rules. It was about breaking personal barriers, mental and emotional walls that had been built over years of self-doubt. Today, I teach English to those who were once like me, lost, afraid, and hesitant. I share my story with them, reminding them that the path to success is not about being perfect, but about perseverance. Teaching has become my calling, and it has given me a sense of purpose I never imagined. I watch as students step out of their shells, break free from their fears, and begin to live the lives they once thought were out of reach. In many ways, I am still learning alongside them. Every new student teaches me something about myself, about resilience, hope, and the power of never giving up.